I want to congratulate all of you who have come back, and I hope that you have lots of coffee, because this is a difficult part of the afternoon. It's not difficult for us. We here on this panel consider this the most important session. It deals, after all, with limiting systemic risk and how to deal with large, complex financial institutions. And there are many aspects, of course, to this, from the legal aspect to the intricacies of oversight, to the information requirements, and to the interconnectivity of large institutions. Now, I will moderate this as carefully as I can, which doesn't allow me very much time to speak for myself. But since I do have a few moderate views on the subject, I will reserve a couple of minutes at the end to give them to you. To spare us a little bit of time, since we're running a little bit late, I think we will start from left to right. And as you know, all of the speakers here this afternoon are well known. Their past is described in detail. So without further time passage, let me begin by asking the first speaker to come on here. And as you know, the first speaker is Erik Berglöf, and he's a very prominent individual. If you want to speak from here or sit, it makes no difference.
Thank you, and thank you, George. Thank you, Rob, for letting me be part of this initiative. It's a great honor. So I thought I would follow up a bit on what Andy Holden was talking about in the previous session. I'll do so based on the European experience. And the European experience is, of course, important in its own right, but it's also important because it's really the part of the world that is most integrated, and it illustrates many of the challenges that we are facing in cross-border banking. I also do so based on having been part of the sort of crisis response in Europe and have some of the scars to prove that I was part of that. It was a very interesting and good learning experience. So what I'm going to try to do is to describe what the issues were, say something about the response that we saw during the crisis and after the crisis, and say also something about the issues that this response give rise to, and what we have done to try to deal with those issues in turn. But in the end, I'm going to try to make an argument that we will never reach a foolproof system, a sort of fully state contingent global arrangement. There will be large gaps, and we will have to live with them. And I'm going to argue that we need to think about institutions or institutional designs that can respond to those crisis situations or to address those gaps in a preventive way. So it's going to be about finding institutions that could fill those gaps when they occur. So let me start with this picture. And this depicts the Austrian banks, Austria here being the home country, and the Austrian banks had systemic subsidiaries in 16 countries, and in many countries more than one systemically important institution. And you can see just from the picture that it raises all kinds of issues. It raises issues of home hosts that we have touched upon. It raises issues of possibly host measures that are being implemented by individual host countries may also spill over to other host countries. And of course, when we're at the peak of the crisis in Europe, there was a very serious danger that measures taken by home countries might lead to very bad spillovers in subsidiaries. So when the banks in Western Europe were bailed out, the banks in Austria were bailed out, Austrian politicians were saying that, you know, we're not going to have any money from Austrian taxpayers go into subsidiaries outside Austria. And of course, had they done so, you can imagine what the response would have been from the host countries of these subsidiaries, and we would have a very dramatic unraveling. And of course, the picture does not get easier when you look at add the Italian banks. So here you now also add on top of this sort of home issues. And some of the Italian banks also worked out of Austria through mergers and so on. So there is another level of complexity. The next part of this sort of very complicated web in Europe is the Nordic web. And here you could have argued that this was the simplest possible case. It was basically Swedish-based banks, 4 of them, that were active in 8 countries. They had most of the exposures were really in the Baltics, and it should have been a relatively easy situation to deal with. They were deeply integrated. They had done a lot of preparation in terms of establishing collaboration between home and host authorities. They had a lead regulator in the Swedish system. We know the outcome. We know that the international community had to come in and rescue Latvia with a very significant program. We know that the losses of the Swedish banks have been very substantial. So even in this relatively simple situation, it was very difficult. And of course, also here, the fact that these banks, even though they were mostly working out of Sweden, they had to work with 8 regulators, 8 supervisors, like 14 different governance codes, because several countries had parallel corporate governance codes and so on. So it was a very complex situation. Another part of the puzzle was the Greek situation. And of course, the Greek, you may not think of the Greek banks as being very important, but they were actually systemically important in 6 countries in Southeast Europe. This is still very much an open question how these subsidiary relationship will survive through the troubles that Greece is now going through. So yet another level of complexity. Then you had the German banks, and they were often there were banks that may not or maybe should not never have entered into subsidiaries abroad, but did so, and now are questioning that, so they might withdraw some of them from the. You had Dutch banks that have been largely withdrawing, Belgian banks that are also largely withdrawing from the region. France, very large presence. They were mostly outside the collaboration that I will describe in a minute, but they were, of course, important in the region. British banks, not so important in the region, but they also were very quick to withdraw many of the exposures when the crisis hit. So a lot of differences in the strategic orientation of the banks in Europe at the time of the crisis. You can go on like this, and in the end, you see it's a very complex web of interrelationships and potential spillovers from home to host, between host countries and possibly also between home countries. And at the time, at the peak of the crisis, there was essentially no authority at the European level to deal with these relationships. And there was no mandate for the European Commission essentially to play a role in this. And it took a very long time for the European Commission to get involved in a meaningful way. And what you also can see that the financial system did not respect the EU borders. This was a major reason why the Commission felt that they could not really get involved. The fact that countries like Ukraine was an important host country was a very large difficulty in the crisis. And there was no private sector coordination whatsoever in this at the peak of the crisis. So maybe we can say yes, maybe we should never have had this kind of deep financial integration. But the data is very clear that in the period leading up to the crisis, and there's a lot of data here and a lot of work has been done on this, and unlike other parts of the world where the evidence of financial integration and growth is not very strong, it's very strong in Eastern Europe. So this is something that we would like to preserve, but the question is, can we do so? Because these relationship also built very large vulnerabilities. FX exposures were very considerable, very large debt level, Fed debt bubbles in individual countries. And here and in the rest of the world, the global crisis revealed very large gaps in the architecture, both in the global and the regional architecture, and very major weakness in the national regulation. There was a lack of harmonization. There was a collective action problems in the crisis response that I've already mentioned, home host, host, public-private sector. There was no institutions to deal with this. Post-crisis vulnerabilities shifted from subsidiaries to parents when the fiscal aftermath of the crisis. So what we see now in Greece, for example, is not so much the subsidiaries on their own are very healthy, but the problem is that they have a sick sovereign behind the parent banks, and that's what's creating the problem. Well, a lot has happened, and I won't go into detail. Maybe Claudio will say more about this. But the G20 in Seoul did its part, the G20 Paris, there were also improvements. The EU itself a lot has happened in terms of institutional framework in Europe. New institutions have been created, new regulation. There's also been, and this maybe is a dominant pattern, and Andy Holden was mentioning this, the real revolution, if you want, has been the shift in power towards host countries. So before the crisis, the sort of tendency was very clearly towards home country rule. We saw in the crisis this did not work, and the response has been host country rule as the major paradigm. And of course, this also is related to issues that were also discussed in the previous panel of capital controls and so on. So this post-crisis response raises a number of issues. First, that all the regulation that we now see, for example, Basel III, has very different implications depending on the level of development and the nature of the financial system in a particular country. The home-host balance, when we shift towards host country regulation, we risk very major financial fragmentation, so you need to try to find solutions to that. Lack of harmonization, coordination are key issues. Cross-border resolution, a major issue. Moral hazard, of course, we have created immense expectations of these very complex cross-border arrangements actually being supported in a time of crisis. And it, of course, raises issues of political economy of regulation and how this these institutions, regulatory institutions, can stay independent. So how can we address these issues? Well, a lot has been done in terms of trying to phase in the implementation of regulation, using floors rather than targets, flexible interpretation, and so on. We can make some progress there. So the home-host balance, we need to create structures at the regional level that can maybe, where host countries feel that they can have some representation. That's what we're trying to do in Europe, and there's some progress in that connection. The harmonization, coordination, and enforcement through informal private sector initiatives, and that's what I'm going to spend a little bit the time that I have left on. So what I'm going to argue is that we need sort of a flexible global financial architecture. It's an architecture that where we design international financial institutions to internalize spillovers across jurisdictions. So we will have to live with very significant gaps, and we should try to encourage the international institutions to intervene and fill these gaps, and also address pre-crisis issues or preventive issues in financial regulation and supervision. We also need to align IFI incentives. So there were quite a lot of collaboration in Europe between the international financial institutions in the crisis. We need to think how we can align these incentives better. There was a lot of collaboration in the crisis also between multilateral and bilateral support. For example, the Latvian case, both the EU and the IMF, but also the Nordics contributed, and I think this is something that we need to develop more. But what I really think is critical, and what was absolutely critical for the solution of the European problem, was the involvement of the private sector. And I want to say a few words about the so-called Vienna Initiative, which included 16 banks plus home and host authorities in Europe. And so here, the problem was to try to see how could we deal with this collective action problem that you had all these banks with exposures in Eastern Europe. You knew that there would be deleveraging, and it was the interest of each individual bank to withdraw as quickly as possible while asset values were reasonable. But for the banks as a collective, they wanted a managed deleveraging. And that was the challenge of policymakers, and to try to achieve that collaboration, and also to make sure that some of these spillovers didn't happen that I mentioned. Home country measures discriminating against host countries and so on, and individual host countries taking measures that would spill over to others. And that's what very much would happen in this Vienna Initiative that started as a collaboration between a few banks, between a few home and host countries, and by now have about 130 people around the table from 16 banks and basically all the home and host countries in Europe. And I think that is a model that can be used for many things. It can also be used to address some of the issues that can lead to crisis. The FX exposures is one area where this initiative has been quite effective. We have now some rules that apply to the banks. We have now starting 2 new groups that are dealing with a different implementation of the Basel III and dealing with the differences in NPL management across countries, different bankruptcy legislation and so on. Let me conclude with just summarizing what the points I've tried to make. There has been significant progress in strengthening and harmonizing the global regulatory and supervisory structures, and particularly maybe at the national level. We have filled gaps in the European financial structure. We have had a massive increase in the host country regulation, a real paradigm shift. There are still major differences, large gaps, a lot of capture in this, unfortunately, but so we need much more flexible response mechanism, and I've argued that this Vienna Initiative is one possible such model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erik.